So the second major topic we discussed in the Ethics of Paranormal Investigation panel was the fact that sometimes the people who are presenting with claims of paranormal abilities are children. Usually children whose parents have been pushing them into the public eye, or children whose parents think that they have some particular extraordinary ability, like psychic powers or being able to talk to ghosts. There was a 14-year-old girl in India last year whose mom had been promoting her as having the ability to see while blindfolded. And when the skeptic, who the TV station had recruited to appear on this program where she was going to demonstrate her ability, when the skeptic started insisting on certain rigorous testing protocols, like sealing the edges of the blindfold so that the girl couldn't see, underneath or out the sides of the blindfold, the girl just broke down and started sobbing, and it was really sad. There are more serious cases in which the child can actually get into trouble with the law, or at the very least with their family. And obviously there's a spectrum of cases where, on one end the child knows that she or he is hoaxing people intentionally, and on the other end the child really believes he can talk to ghosts. But either way, we as a society tend to treat children as being less culpable when they're intentionally hoaxing people. So basically I asked the panel, how do you deal with cases like these when your target is a child? Do you have different ways of approaching a debunking like that? And everyone agreed it was really difficult and that there wasn't any obvious best approach. Randy had faced a case in the 80s. It was again a 14-year-old girl named Tina Rash, who allegedly had telekinetic powers. There were reports of furniture flying across the room in her house all by itself. And it was only when the media, there was a video camera that had accidentally been left turned on, and in going through the footage, Randy found Tina had intentionally knocked over a lamp that in the officially filmed footage had seemed to fall over of its own accord. So Randy exposed her. She was sort of nationally embarrassed, and it caused a lot of stress and trouble at her. I didn't mention she was adopted, so it caused a lot of trouble at her foster home, which was already kind of a tenuous situation, and she ended up having a lot of problems later in life, not provably connected to this, but I'm sure this didn't help. Anyway, that was sort of a more extreme, more tragic example of what can happen when someone is debunked publicly and when that someone's a child. So again, my panel didn't have a lot of sort of brilliant solutions to this, but Karen Stolzno did bring up one good point, which is that when you're talking to the media as a paranormal investigator about a case involving a child, you do have the choice on how you frame the discussion. So instead of framing it about what that child did and how that child fooled people, you can talk about the phenomenon. So you can talk about why telekinesis or psychic powers don't work and how there isn't evidence for them, and you can talk about the biases that make people susceptible to these kinds of illusions, that sort of thing. The third topic we talked about was confidentiality, which is an issue that had occurred to me when I was reading about some of the fields that paranormal investigation draws on, like journalism and medicine and psychology, all of which have this very strict ethical code about protecting the privacy of your source in journalism or your patient in medicine and therapy and psychology. So I wanted to know whether my panel had any rules for themselves, like do you tell the people you're investigating that you might use their case as an example in a book or an article or on a talk show? It's less relevant when the case that you're dealing with is someone who's put themselves in the public eye, like Popoff, the commercial faith healer who was trying to defraud people of their money. But it's more relevant in cases where you're investigating a private citizen's reports of a haunting or their experience that they think they've had an alien encounter. And Ben Radford he's written a book called Scientific Paranormal Investigation, and so he talked about a case in which there was this alleged haunting, and he wrote it up in his book, but he was very careful about which identifying details he included and which he didn't. So he would include the name of the town that it happened, for example, and I guess the first names of the family members, I think. But he did not, for example, put a photo of the front of the house in the story. And that's partly because that can help pinpoint the actual identity of the family for anyone who recognizes the house, but it's also because they are haunting tourists who like to track down the allegedly haunted houses and go, stake them out and explore them. So this is also a way of just protecting the family from that kind of harassment. So this is the sort of thing that he thinks about. The fourth topic we discussed I specifically directed it at the magicians on the panel, so mainly Randy and Banachek. And it was about, when you're a magician, do you take any particular precautions to make sure that your audience understands that your show is just trickery and not actually evidence of the paranormal? Because that's kind of a dicey situation to be in which, there's a really sort of fuzzy line, at least for some audiences, between good showmanship and actual, seeming actual magic. So Banachek talks about how this is especially relevant for mentalist acts like the one that he does, because apparently people are much more willing to accept that, well, I don't know how they did that, but clearly it was sleight of hand or some kind of trickery if it's a regular magic act. But for a mentalist act where you're appearing to read people's minds, people are much more willing to attribute that to actual psychic abilities, which is ethically problematic. So Randy had actually done more mentalist acts earlier in his career, and he'd had this difficulty where people would come up to him for private readings after the show, even despite his disclaimers about it being just a show. And Banachek said as his career has gone on, he's been increasingly strict about including multiple disclaimers throughout the show, because people will forget, or they will, disregard the disclaimers at the beginning, or, the disclaimers at the end won't work. You need to just keep reminding them that what they're seeing is fake. And Banachek also made the interesting point that you might think that demonstrating how you did a trick would be this great way of showing people that, these things are just very convincing illusions, and that psychic powers, this isn't actually evidence of psychic powers. And that is true for your show, but the thing is, especially in mentalism, there are a lot of different ways to create the same effect. And so if people see how you did a trick, and then they go to another mentalist act, and that guy's doing it differently, and so it's clear that he couldn't be doing it with your mechanism, your trick, then apparently, Banachek said, to a lot of people, that's very strong evidence that second magician is actually doing real magic, because they can tell, well, he couldn't be using a trick because I've seen how that's done as a trick, and so this must be real. So it was kind of ironic. So Banachek said he doesn't, he adds the disclaimers, but he doesn't actually try to demonstrate to people that it's just an illusion.